This paper on decadence and arts funding is a version of a paper I delivered as part of the Political Performances Working Group at the International Federation for Theatre Research in July 2021. My thanks, first of all, to the working group conveners, to Trish Reed, to Julia Boll, and to Cristina Delgado Garcia. And it's titled Decadent Expenditure. Funding for the arts is haunted by decadence. Think of Pat Buchanan vilifying Robert Mapplethorpe in the murky depths of the US culture wars. We should not subsidize decadence, he said, much as the Nazis condemned the cultural decadence of degenerate art. Or Jesse Helms standing on the floor of the Senate, arguing that, quote, an unmistakable decadence has saturated American society, end quote, in no small part because of Ron Afey, that indefatigable scourge of bourgeois morality. I'm also reminded of an article by Asad Baig, which seems as relevant at the dawn of the 2020s as it did when it was published in 2012, when the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, was forwarding a devastating austerity agenda. He argued that to fund the arts in times of crisis, quote, is just middle-class decadence, when some have no credit to crunch, end quote. Decadence has rhetorical power, particularly its negative valences, as profligate, unproductive, useless, or perverse. But I'm interested in approaching decadence not just as a term that's applied to performance and performers in puritanical diatribes. I'm interested in exploring the embodiment and enactment of decadence as dissonance or dissent. This is what draws me to the work of the North American artist Paul McCarthy and the Dutch theatre company Wunderbaum, as it speaks to how the cultural politics of decadence relates to the delegitimization of the arts and arts funding in times of crisis. Although I'll be focusing on a historical moment cast in the long shadow of the 2008 financial crash and the introduction of austerity measures in Holland, the broader issues at stake are as relevant now as they've ever been, and this despite the fact that big government has temporarily superseded the rolling back of state intervention. I'm particularly interested in how multiple connotations of austerity and decadence play out across the bodies of performers and artworks at odds with conventional forms of use and productivity, and that undermine appeals to common sense. Perhaps a taste for the uncommon has something to teach us about the attribution of value, and why some people and practices are considered necessary or worthwhile, while others are marginalised as enervating drains on the health and wealth of a nation. In 2001, the city of Rotterdam commissioned a sculpture by McCarthy called Santa Claus, which is meant to stand in Rotterdam's Theatre Square, although it was deemed offensive by a number of dismayed locals, and it took another 7 years before it found a permanent home in Eindhovensplein in 2008. St. Nicholas holds a bell in one hand and a rounded pine tree in the other, but the tree's features make it look like an enormous butt plug, giving it the nickname Kabuta butt plug, or the gnome butt plug. The timing's significant as it coincided with the dawn of the 2008 financial crash and the introduction of austerity measures by the Netherlands' debt-ridden government. It became a fulcrum for debate about moral and aesthetic value, as well as the extent to which public arts funding could be justified when essential sectors were jeopardised. Wunderbaum took this controversy as a point of departure for their 2010 performance at Looking for Paul. It was originally devised as part of a residency at California Institute of the Arts in Los Angeles, before going on to win a Total Theatre Award at the 2014 Edinburgh Fringe Festival. The audience is led to believe that it was made with and inspired by Inez van Dam, a bookstore owner living in Rotterdam, who's actually played by company member Maartje Remmers. The performance and credits present Inez as a real person, extending the hinterland between reality and fiction that cuts across the company's work. They also involved the performer and producer John Malpede in one iteration, and the cultural ambassador Daniel Franklin, another, who played himself when it went on tour, and that's the version that I've seen. It's split into 3 sections. In the first, Inez presents an endearingly earnest introduction to the city of Rotterdam, illustrated by a PowerPoint filled almost entirely with selfies of famous and less salubrious landmarks, where we learn that the Kabuta butt plug is situated opposite the bookshop where she works. She's not happy, and is persuaded to take revenge on McCarthy in LA, his home city, by participating in a performance that would out him as a fraud. The performance's much longer second section moves on to document creative differences that beset the company's devising process and Inez's involvement, or so we're led to believe, as they found themselves struggling with the responsibility of putting their $20,000 funding to good use, which was secured from LA's Department of Cultural Affairs and the Foundation for Dutch Artists Abroad. It features nothing more than the company sitting down on a row of chairs reading emails sent to one another and to their producers over the course of the creative process. There's an austerity to it, stripping back the theatrical machine to its essentials, with the company failing to fulfill their obligations to be productive as they deteriorate in fits of artistic infighting. Walter Bartz is determined to seek the involvement of McCarthy, while another company member, Martis Janssen, wants to capitalise on their European avant-garde credentials. Marlene Scholten demeans Inez and her provincial story, and Inez gradually realises that the group have no intention of seeking revenge on an artist that they clearly admire. What emerges is a playful challenge to the piety of artists who express social commitments while exploiting intended beneficiaries, poking fun at the hypocrisy of their own conspicuous consumption in Los Angeles while they're at it, and a scathing attack on censorship and the irony of travelling to America to make work about arts funding in Holland. The performance's final section is an homage to McCarthy that disrupts the austereness of the preceding scenes. Stagehands remove the chairs and microphones to reveal a crude set, little more than a bed and a toilet contained within scaffolding. Janssen enters wearing a long white shirt, stuffed rubber gloves with grotesquely elongated fingers, and a pair of enormous ears that protrude from a blonde wig, all drawn from McCarthy's video performances. Janssen heads to the toilet, apparently to defecate, which he then cleans relentlessly with a realistically shit-like substance. Scholten stumbles onto the stage looking inebriated and dousing herself in alcohol, and drags Inez wearing pigtails and a McCarthy-esque mask by means of a leash. Finally, Frankel, dressed as a chef, wheels in a trolley carrying ketchup, mayonnaise, chocolate sauce, and a bowl of spaghetti, all of which are McCarthy's staples, semi-methodically squirting or flinging each about the stage, or stuffing them into pants. Janssen smothers his surroundings with shit before thrusting a giant red pencil into the toilet, throwing the toilet onto the bed, and mock-fucking its orifice. By this point, the stage has become a noxious sight of utter degradation. Noses pressed against sodden backsides, and bodies stumbling in a dazed stupor. The final section is the most relevant to the study of decadent aesthetics, but its political resonances are incomprehensible without the preceding scenes, which ruminate on the US culture wars and the introduction of austerity measures in Holland. In one of the email exchanges read aloud in the second section, Frankel explains how he understands the former. Quote, "I'm kind of worried how the audience will receive a bunch of fancy Europeans telling us that our funding system is wrong. We ended up getting national arts funding before we put a man on the moon. And things went okay until the Reagan Republicans totally freaked out when they found out that they'd funded Mapplethorpe's photo of a bullwhip stuck in his ass. It seems like a better idea that you can learn how we got fucked in our own country and then try to prevent it in your own." End quote. He builds up to this passage by suggesting that the company explores something more tasteful and less antagonistic toward McCarthy, like Pina Bausch, he says, revealing his own fetishization of fancy Europeans. He also expresses frustration at the inability of the company to make progress, revealing his own expectations around what constitutes productive creativity, which is to say, a demonstrably productive process accountable to its backers. What he worries about is indolence and potentially offensive transgression. Not a far cry, in other words, from Buchanan and Helms's plea that we should not subsidise decadence. One of the most important issues that the show explores centres on the legitimacy of a debt-riddled nation spending €180,000 on a public art object that was seen by some to offer little benefit to the community. These concerns were exacerbated when the pro-business People's Party for Freedom and Democracy took control of a coalitional cabinet in 2010 under the leadership of Mark Rutte. Rutte's cabinet was struggling to decrease the size of its national debt, adding grist to the mill of those framing austerity as an economic necessity, like the Dutch State Secretary for Culture, who sent a letter to arts and cultural organisations on the 10th of June 2011 announcing plans for a €200 million funding cut, including a 50% cut to stipends and working grants for artists, and the performing arts were particularly badly affected. Leading Dutch artists and curators responded in an open letter, explaining how the Secretary for Culture regarded, quote, traditional art as merely the superfluous ornamentation of a society. Contemporary art is labelled as alienating and even, although no one actually says it out loud, as degenerate art, end quote. In other words, art and artist were shifted into a decadent dimension. The far-right politician Geert Wilders had previously argued that, quote, hard-working Dutch citizens should not have to facilitate the needs of artists who, in practicing their subsidised or left-wing hobby, feign work thanks to state injections, end quote. Wilders' attempt to undermine the legitimacy of work in the arts as work might have been dismissed as the ranting of an extremist, were it not for his party's political gains that year. They came third in the 2010 election, and the Secretary for Culture's support of his comments. Also, when there seems to be no alternative to austerity, it's easier to convince the beleaguered public that practices and livelihoods not explicitly bound to productivity enhancement are expendable or parasitic, decadent expenditure to fund decadent lifestyles. It's also easier to instrumentalise pejorative language. The benefits scrounger, the benefits cheat, the migrant workforce, all of whom are identified by Imogen Tyler as revolting subjects, both provoking disgust and prone to revolt. Looking for Paul engages with the view that arts funding can read as profligacy when publicly funded artworks antagonise a community's austere tastes. But it also challenges the legitimacy of that view, opening out to the oppositional potential of a decadence that revels in revolting acts of physical expenditure. For instance, the gigantic pencil thrust into the bowl of a toilet, aside from being a nod to McCarthy's video performances, magnifies the perceived uselessness, unproductivity, or wastefulness of artistic endeavour, lampooning perceptions of contemporary art as a pastime of adolescence yet to make peace with capitalist realism. In the critic Ralph Rugoff's summation, is indicative of a Rabelaisian theatre of regression, which seems a peculiarly decadent turn of phrase. The literature scholar David Weir defines decadence as, quote, a subjective principle, more a matter of sensibility than rationality, not a common sense, but something more refined, an uncommon sense that delights in disgust, or in things that people who have normal taste react to with revulsion, end quote. This is a helpful way of thinking about the performance's cabal of McCarthy-esque characters. They delight in human and culinary waste, flaunting gratuitousness in ways that align with the lineage of performance surveyed by Dominic Johnson in a 2019 study of extremity in performance. And I'm thinking especially of the Kipper Kids. It riffs on decadent aesthetics to the extent that decadence refers to an uncommon sense that delights in the ruinously or perversely unconventional, not least the unconventionally productive. Energetic forces and material objects are expended in ways that are methodically unproductive in the economic sense, but tremendously productive in a creative sense that luxuriates in waste and wastefulness. It puts me in mind of Bataille, who writes that, quote, minds accustomed to seeing the development of productive forces as the ideal end of activity refuse to recognize that energy, which constitutes wealth, must ultimately be spent lavishly, end quote. Wunderbaum give the last word to lavish squandering. The decadence of such wasteful expenditure is not simply anti or apolitical. There's an activist dimension at stake that refuses to ignore the relationship of economic to moral austerity and the ways in which productivism channels and regulates more disorderly energies and inclinations. So to wrap up, Wunderbaum's Looking for Paul illuminates how the arts are delegitimized as decadent hobbies in times of crisis by staging the cultural politics of decadence as a field of competing interests. It works with an uncommon sense to expose the contingencies of misleadingly common sense views and solutions, and invites us to consider decadence outside of the rhetorical utility it offers to odious Puritans like Buchanan and Helms. Decadence can also be turned against utility and the conventionally productive, subverting forms of moral and economic austerity that delegitimize support for the arts and creativity itself. Perhaps then we might turn to decadence so as to better understand those moments when the arts are most threatened, when their legitimacy is questioned, and when utility and productivism have collided with a dominant sense of what constitutes the valuable, the necessary, the beautiful, and the worthwhile.